as we begin. This is the first research seminar of the semester from Jepson School, and first Marshall Center session as well. We're fortunate today to have Hugh Liebert with us. He did his undergraduate work at Harvard University, PhD from University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought. He's our John Marshall Visiting Research Fellow for the year, and we couldn't be happier to have him with us. We're very lucky to have him here for the year. He's going to spend a lot of his time, I think, working on his book project, which is called Between City and Empire. And today he's going to talk to us about a paper called The Founder of Globalization, Our Strange Fascination with Alexander the Great. So thank you, Hugh.
Okay, thanks, Terry. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a Friday afternoon to hear a lecture on a very arcane topic in ancient history. I appreciate it. On the off chance that one or two of you didn't get a chance to read every word of the massive document that Terry sent out in connection to this talk, I'm going to try to give an executive summary of it at the beginning. Terry told me to talk for about 30 minutes. I think I'm bound to speak for a little bit longer than that, but hopefully around 40 minutes or so. Okay. So since Alexander's death in the 4th century BCE, every age has projected its own heroes and villains in his image, and ours is no different. Our Alexander has been a feminist, a multiculturalist, a corporate titan. He's also been a kind of forerunner of Hitler or Stalin. But what sets our age apart, I think, is the depth of our fascination with Alexander the Great. Now, some of you might be thinking that you're not particularly fascinated with Alexander the Great, at least not yet. But when you pay attention to Alexander's studies, it's really remarkable how many books have been published on Alexander over the last 10 years or so. There have been dozens of books, ranging from very dry scholarly literature to considerably more exciting children's books. My favorite among those is a book called I Am the Great Horse, which actually tells the story of Alexander's campaigns from his horse's perspective, which is a really fantastic book. The first line is, my name is Bucephalus, and you should know right away that I'm no black beauty. Okay? So there's some very exciting books on Alexander published recently. There have also been, there's been a movie, Oliver Stone's Alexander, which was released in 2004, and rumors of many more movies to come. Now, in light of the movie in particular, I think it's easy to dismiss our interest in Alexander as just some kind of cinema-induced curiosity, as if Alexander were a Hollywood celebrity or something like that. But
I'm going to stop you for a second. Yeah. Can people hear? I'm seeing signals that you can't. Maybe try to. Let's try this.
My camera, actually. That doesn't do anything for group at all.
Oh, it doesn't?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can try to speak louder. Should I continue? Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'll try to speak up. Just let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll try to speak even louder. So I was saying that I think it's wrong to dismiss our interest in Alexander as if it just had to do with this movie, because I don't think that deals seriously enough with the way that ancient examples are relevant to us, and that includes the example of Alexander. They show up frequently in our political discourse, and this was particularly true, I think, after the Cold War, when commentators and intellectuals from all across the political spectrum were very eager to drape our statesmen in togas and tunics. The most common metaphor was Roman, but Alexander came in for consideration too. He figured very prominently, actually, in a 2002 Pentagon study of how America could maintain its power. Alexander was one of the best examples, actually, of how not to do this, but it was very interesting because of our interest in empire and maintaining our power. Now, I think because of that, you could also dismiss our interest in Alexander as just having to do with this fleeting interest we had in imperialism at the end of the Cold War. But I think that's not quite right either, because Alexander figures in our political discourse not only insofar as it deals with empire, but also insofar as it deals with the murkier process we call globalization. I think the idea that Alexander has something to teach us on that front kind of lurks behind a lot of our interest in him. But even if that's not true, I think it's on that front that we can learn something from him. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to argue today that Alexander can be understood as the founder of globalization. And I'm going to make that case in two parts. First, I want to say what I think globalization is, And I'm going to look at 3 different accounts one can give of globalization, and then propose a 4th account, my own account, that focuses on the way that globalization is characterized by the sense that we have multiple allegiances to different levels of political bodies and organizations, and the sense that we're not always sure where our true allegiances lie. That's the kind of account of globalization I want to give. And then in the second part, I'm going to give an interpretation of one of the key ancient texts on Alexander that we have, which is Plutarch's Life of Alexander. And I'm going to suggest that this text is a case study in my theory of globalization. And then I'll conclude by talking a little bit about why it matters how we understand the history of globalization and what it would mean for globalization to have a founder in the first place. Okay. So first, globalization. The term globalization is famously hard to define because everyone uses it and not many people define it. So it'll be useful, I think, to start by going through what I think are the 3 main meanings of the word globalization and the account of what drives the process of globalization that's associated with each of these meanings. So I want to start by doing that, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I take globalization to mean, or how I want to focus on it. So I'll go briefly through the first 2, because they're pretty familiar. First of all, globalization can mean the expansion of global markets. This account looks at individuals as economic agents who are woven into mutually advantageous webs of exchange with potentially every other economic agent in the world, regardless of international boundaries. So globalization, this is a kind of market account of globalization. Or globalization can sum to mind an idea of a global community or an international community. This account tends to portray individuals as moral agents who, when they reflect rationally on their commitments to other human beings, realize that from a moral standpoint, the fact that they happen to have been born in a particular community is pretty arbitrary. So they ought to treat every individual everywhere in the world, regardless of the national communities they belong to, with a kind of respect, dignity, and so on. So this we could call a cosmopolitan account of globalization. Now, the third account of globalization that I want to look at, I want to focus a little bit more closely on this. I call this the Thumotic account of globalization for reasons that will become clear. I want to summon to mind the Socrates' analysis of thumos in Plato's Republic. The word thumos is usually translated spirit. A more ordinary language translation might be pride. But Socrates says that this is one of 3 parts of the soul, famously, reason, desire, and then you have spirit or thumos, pride. And he says that this is the part of the soul that orients our concern with our own self-worth, particularly as it's reflected in the eyes of other human beings. So when we feel as though our self-worth has been challenged unjustifiably, we feel anger. When we feel as though it's been challenged with some justice, we feel shame. When we feel the pleasure of our self-worth increasing in others' eyes, we feel honor. When we long for an increase of our self-worth, we feel a kind of ambition or love of honor or love of victory. So all of these diverse psychological phenomena are grouped for Socrates in this one part of the soul, thumos. But there's a kind of ambivalence, I think, in thumos that Socrates points out. On the one hand, when I individually seek the esteem of others, when I seek honor in others' eyes, that's my thumos operating for Socrates, right? So there's a kind of selfish side to thumos. It can be behind self-promotion. Like if I were to run for office as an independent, right? All the honor would accrue to me. That would be thumos. Or thumos can describe our ability to belong to a group, to have a kind of identity that we share with other individuals. And this is a kind of service side of thumos. So you can say thumos is also operating when we sacrifice ourselves, say in battle, to defend our own. This is thumos too. Now, it's important, I think, to focus on that ambivalence in the concept, because the 2 accounts of globalization that come out of this part of the soul, the thumotic part of the soul, each take their bearings from one part of thumos, one part of those 2 elements that make the ambivalence. The first thumotic account of globalization focuses on the selfish side of thumos, the individual's desire for honor for him or herself. This account is very familiar to us from Kojève's interpretation of Hegel in the 30s. It's, I'm sure, widely known to everyone from Fukuyama's book in the 90s, The End of History and The Last Man. And there's actually been a very interesting recent version of this by Alexander Wendt, an IR theorist, just a few years ago. But since I'm sure this is widely known, I'll just go through it really quickly. But the argument here is that the individual's desire for honor is such that you don't just desire honor from a particular group of people, but ideally you'd like the honor of everyone, the recognition of everyone. And so there's a kind of desire for universality built into your desire for honor individually. And because you don't want the honor of just any schmo, but you want the honor of someone who's equal in worth or superior to you in worth, there's a kind of desire for equality built into the individual's desire for esteem. You want to be recognized by people whose recognition is worth having. And as a result of those two aspects of the individual's desire for honor, the final political situation that would be satisfying for human beings is what Kojève calls a universal homogeneous state, which is to say a political situation in which every individual is recognized by every other individual, and all of them are recognized to be worthy of awarding recognition. Right? So that should be pretty familiar, I think, to everyone. If you start from the service side of thumos, though, the part of thumos that allows us to have a particular identity, to experience other individuals as our own and be willing to sacrifice for them, you get a very different picture of what globalization looks like. Thinkers in this camp tend to insist that particular identities aren't going to go anywhere. They're not going to be replaced by some all-inclusive human identity. And they say that for two reasons. First of all, particular identities, according to them, tend to sink their roots very deep into the hearts and minds of the individuals who belong to a group, who belong to the particular identity. Also, particular identities, they meet a deep human need for defining oneself against someone who's not in your group, which is to say, defining yourself against an other. Insofar as particular identities do that, these guys say, we shouldn't expect them to be eliminated anytime soon. So some of the people in this camp will say that national identities, nation states, are going to be around for as far as the eye can see. People like John Mearsheimer will make that kind of argument. Or others say that particular identities that are larger, more inclusive than the nation, but smaller than humanity, will be around for a long time, like civilizations or religions. So people like Samuel Huntington are famous for making this kind of argument. But all of these people want to insist on the durability of particular identities. Now that might seem like a denial of globalization in any meaningful sense, rather than a theory of it, but that's actually not quite true, I think. Because it's possible to look at policies that look like globalization, say the increasing span of global markets or the strengthening of international institutions. It's possible to look at those things and say that they benefit some particular groups more than others. Critics of economic globalization often make that kind of case with respect to how global markets strengthen rich nations and impoverish poor nations and so on. Thinkers in this camp say that's exactly right, and that's why it's a good strategy for people who belong to particular identities to follow in certain cases. It's good for them to increase their power by expanding markets and international institutions. So you can get a theory of globalization, but it looks much more like certain particular groups manipulating others, right, in this theory of globalization. Okay. So those are the theories that I just wanted to lay out before getting started on my own. We have a market account of globalization, a cosmopolitan account, and a thumotic account with its two varieties. The one that Kojève and Fukuyama made famous, which I'll call the universalist thumotic account, since it ends in a universal homogeneous state. And the other account, which insists on the permanence and the durability of particular identities, which I'll call a particularist thumotic account. Okay. Now I want to turn and talk about the kind of way of approaching globalization that I want to use. I want to start from the premises of the thumotic account, because I think it's there where we see the influence of globalization on political matters most clearly. So I'm not primarily interested in in globalization considered as an economic phenomenon or in its ethical aspects. I'm mainly interested in it as it influences politics. And so I'm going to start from thumos. I think it said a second ago that thumos has this kind of ambivalence built into it, where there's a selfish side and a service side to thumos. Each of the accounts that we've looked at so far, the thumotic accounts, take their bearings from one part of that and kind of exclude the other, right? So if you take the individual pursuit of esteem and stress that, like in the way that Fukuyama or Kojève does, you tend to neglect, I think, the aspect of thumos that makes you want to belong to a particular identity and really take that seriously. Whereas if you start on the other side and start on the service side, like the particularist thumotic account, you tend to overlook the sense in which a particular identity isn't necessarily satisfying or not stable, because there's this individual aspect of thumos, this aspect of self-promotion in it that can make identities very unstable. So what I want to do is try to give a thumotic account that holds on to that ambivalence in thumos and tries to think seriously about out is that neither particular identities nor this universal human identity could be satisfying for human beings. And that actually the way we experience identity, I think, more frequently, but certainly under conditions of globalization, is that we tend to feel multiple allegiances to different levels of identity or different competing identities. And we tend to be a little bit uncertain, at least sometimes, about where our true allegiances lie. So I want to talk about two forms of what I call indeterminate identity that show up on the political level. The first form arises when one feels a tension between an inclusive identity, an all-inclusive identity like humanity, for instance, and a more exclusive identity, like, say, a national identity. I think that thinking about the tensions that arise from these sorts of, these kind of layered identities helps us to articulate some phenomena that we feel intuitively to be really central to globalization. As for instance, when we worry about the propriety of privileging the interests and lives of a fellow national citizen over the interests and lives of someone who's not a fellow national citizen. And I think you can actually make a case that human identities generally, at least as far back as we can see, are divided really in three different levels that kind of show up throughout history. First of all, you could look at a local identity, which is to say identity within a visible particular group, a national or ethnic identity, which is identity within a imaginary or invisible particular group, one that coexists with other particular groups. And then a human identity, a universal identity that's all inclusive, that's also imaginary or invisible, but includes everyone. It's important, I think, to stress that those three identities can exist simultaneously, and that as far as we can tell, they always have existed simultaneously. Because it prevents you from giving an account of an epochal shift in identity, like globalization, for instance, might be, that suggests that the new identity arises ex nihilo, that is, comes out of nowhere. I think it's more honest and more revealing to try to think about the ways in which new identities can emerge from pre-existing older identities. So, for instance, in giving an account of nationalization in the 19th centuries and before, you might try to think about how the nation arises from local identities, right, rather than treating it as this brand new phenomenon that just overwhelms everything else. With respect to globalization, I think it's important to keep in mind how it relates to national identities, how it might arise from them, rather than treating it as just a brand new phenomenon. And being attentive to the indeterminate identities that arise from these different strata of allegiance kind of helps you recognize that problem, I think. Now, the second form of indeterminate identity that I wanted to talk about is one that arises when an individual feels an allegiance to multiple particular groups, like when, say, a recent immigrant feels an allegiance to their new country and also to their old country simultaneously. I think it's important to keep that kind of indeterminate identity in mind because it has a kind of intuitive appeal insofar as it allows us to articulate the kinds of experiences that arise within immigrant communities, within diasporas, but also because it helps us to recognize that it's possible to have an identity that reaches beyond the bounds, say, of a nation, but without arriving at a universal human identity. For that. So someone, say a recent immigrant who feels homesick for their former nation, feels an attachment that stretches beyond the bounds of their current nation, to be sure, but that doesn't mean that it reaches necessarily all the way to a human universal identity. Okay, so I think that focusing on the indeterminate identities that are associated with globalization both allows us to reflect a bit more accurately the kind of psychological claim that we're making when we talk about the ambivalence of thumos. And it also it gives us tools for articulating some of the phenomena we kind of sense are important to globalization too. So that's my theory of globalization, or the way I wanted to kind of approach globalization by looking at it through the lens of indeterminate identity. Okay, now I want to go on and talk about Alexander the Great a little bit. Each of the three accounts of globalization that I've looked at so far have a particular spin on Alexander. The market account tends to stress the trade routes that he forged between East and West and his explorations by sea. The cosmopolitan account will occasionally claim that Alexander is a kind of prophet of the brotherhood of mankind. The Thumotic accounts that I've looked at also make something of Alexander. The Universalist Thumotic account, particularly in Kozhev's form of it, tends to treat Alexander as the first statesman to attempt to establish a world state. And the story is that he did that because he was educated by the philosopher Aristotle. Kojève says that Alexander learned from Aristotle that all human beings share a similar nature, and that for that reason they're all capable of awarding recognition that you'd want. And so if you want the recognition from everyone, well, you should go out and conquer the world and establish a world state, right? That's basically the argument. But Alexander plays a big role in the universalist Thumotic account. For the particularist Thumotic account, they present an Alexander who's radically confined by the particular identities that he has. So he looks more like a traditional imperialist who's out to increase the power of Macedon, or in some cases to increase the power of Greece by conquering the rest of the world. Now, I think that Plutarch's Life of Alexander actually gives us an Alexander that doesn't fit in any of those accounts. And he gives us an Alexander that fits a lot better in the sort of account that I've outlined by talking about indeterminate identity. And I think it's fitting that we find this kind of an account in Plutarch in particular, because Plutarch seems to have had a deep personal experience of the ambivalence of identity. He wrote in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. He was a citizen of the Roman Empire, Plutarch was, with excellent connections among the Roman ruling elite. He was a very proud, patriotic Greek citizen as well. He served as a priest at the Oracle of Delphi for a long time, which by his time was a kind of shrine to Greek national heroes. And Plutarch was also a very active citizen in his small town of Chaeronea. He served in many offices in the city and wrote about it with real passion sometimes. So I think he experienced these multiple levels of identity and also the conflicts between cultures, between Greece and Rome. And this obviously had a big influence on shaping the literary form of the most famous work that Plutarch wrote, the Parallel Lives. The Parallel Lives pair a biography of one Greek statesman with one Roman statesman. And then they have a comparison where Plutarch throws them together and lets them kind of compete with one another to see which of them is better. Right? Some people approach the Parallel Lives as if they're attempting to fuse a kind of harmonious interchange between Roman and Greek culture. Based on how I've just described them, it should be pretty clear that that's not how I read them. I read them as very heated competitions between two statesmen. You can think of them on an analogy of like a boxing match with Plutarch as the Don King, right, who sets up the boxing match and then lets them fight it out for you, and then urges the reader to make a judgment, not just to sit back and say, wow, they're both great, Greece and Rome are wonderful together, but to say who won. Alexander wants to beat Caesar, and Alcibiades wants to beat Coriolanus, Fabius wants to beat Pericles, and so on. Now, it's important, I think, to insist on the literary form of the Parallel Lives because it actually highlights two themes that run throughout the lives and are very important, I think, for understanding Plutarch in general. First theme is that of fraught cultural interchange, non-harmonious cultural interchange. Plutarch picks Greece versus Rome as the animating opposition of his lives. And he does this at a time when Greece is ruled by Rome. And ruled with a kind of rule that Plutarch will sometimes characterize as enslavement, as a very harsh rule. In fact, we have a letter that Plutarch wrote when a young Greek man who was ambitious and was going to go into politics writes Plutarch. And he says, dear Mr. Plutarch, you seem to know a lot about politics. Tell me what I should know about entering into Greek politics. And he says, well, it's all well and good to enter into Greek politics, but you got to remember, if you ever get elected office, always keep in mind that there's the boot of the Roman soldier over your head. Right? So this is the political condition that Plutarch writes these lives under. It's not an idle choice to write heated comparisons of Greek statesmen and Roman statesmen in that kind of climate. It's a bit like if a Quebecer today were to write heated fights between French Canadians and English Canadians, right? That'd be a very charged thing to do. And it turns out that this theme of fraught cultural interchange runs throughout the lives. Plutarch seems to go out of his way to depict political situations in which different cultures are trying to work together and to show the kind of challenges for statesmanship, for leadership that arise when you have a multicultural political body. So that's one theme that the literary form highlights, this theme of cultural interrelations. It also highlights the theme of political ambition. Plutarch, by putting these statesmen into battle with one another, almost imbues them with the kind of ambition to beat the other guy. Right? Like I was saying, Alexander wants to beat Caesar because of the literary form he's put in. And it turns out that Plutarch actually goes out of his way to depict the problems that arise from political ambition in the stories he picks for the lives, too. He's very, very interested in this theme of the kind of challenges that political ambition poses for healthy politics and the ways in which it can be channeled and used for good purposes. Now, those two themes of cultural interchange and ambition run throughout the lives, but they're especially prominent in the life of Alexander. And I think that it's some kind of the interrelation of those two themes that allows Plutarch to give an account of expansive political action that looks a lot like the picture of indeterminate identity as it's related to globalization that I've just outlined. So I want to make that case now through giving an interpretation of Plutarch's life of Alexander. I'm going to start by showing that the Alexander in Plutarch's life doesn't fit within the universalist Thumotic account, the account of Kojève and Fukuyama and those guys, which is to say Plutarch's Alexander is not a statesman who, because he was educated by a philosopher, went out and tried to win the recognition of every individual in the world. I don't think that's the Alexander we get into life. And then I want to show that Alexander he doesn't fit with the particularist Thumotic account either, which is to say he's not radically confined by his particular identities, whether they be Macedonian or Greek. Okay, so first, the case that the Alexander of Plutarch's life doesn't fit in the universalist Thumotic account. Alexander's Macedon is on the fringes of Greece. It's on the geographical fringes in that it's up north. It's kind of buffer state between the northern tribes and the Greek cities in the south of Greece. And it's also on the cultural border of Greece. The Macedonian, as far as we know, was a kind of dialect of Greek that wasn't immediately intelligible to Greeks themselves. Whether Macedonians belonged in the category of Greek or not was disputed throughout their history. And they had a regime that set them apart from the Greeks too, because they were a monarchy, and a very old-style monarchy, more like a Homeric monarchy, which has made them different from the oligarchies and democracies of the Greek cities to the south. Now, that difference between Macedon and Greece and their kind of ambivalent relationship to each other is going to be very important for thinking about how Alexander's political action develops throughout his career. But as Plutarch tells the story, that's not actually the first thing that you notice about the young Alexander. The first thing you notice is that Alexander is incredibly ambitious. He is philotimos. He loves honor. This is the first thing that you see about him. And I just want to read you quickly a little passage from the life where Plutarch talks about Alexander's ambition. Plutarch says, "For since Alexander did not covet pleasure nor even wealth, but excellence and fame," this is virtue and glory, "he considered that the more he should receive from his father, the fewer would be the successes won by himself. Therefore, considering that increase in prosperity meant the squandering upon his father of opportunities for achievement, he, Alexander, preferred to receive from him a realm which afforded not wealth nor luxury and enjoyment, but struggles and wars and ambitions." This is philotimias. These are ambitious projects where he could win honor. So I think that passage shows you both that Alexander is deeply ambitious, that he's a lover of honor, and that his ambition doesn't really have any particular direction. He just wants to do something great. He doesn't really care what it is, but he's very worried that his father will do everything great before he gets to the scene and takes over Macedon. To the extent that Alexander's ambition has any real shape at all when he's a young crown prince, it's provided by the least Greek element in his background, which is the fact that he's going to be a king someday. He's very proud of the fact that he's a crown prince. In fact, we have a story that Alexander was running around one day. He was apparently an excellent runner, very, very fast. And someone walks up to him and says, "Alexander, you're a very, very fast runner. You should probably compete in the Olympic Games. You'd probably win, right?" And he turns around and says to him, "I won't compete in the Olympics unless I'm running against kings, right? Only kings are worthy of competing with him." And he doesn't enter the Olympics or anything like that. But it shows you that he's very proud of being a king. Now, that changes, I think, once he starts studying under Aristotle. Plutarch tells us that Alexander's father sends away to Greece for the most famous philosopher, and he gets Aristotle, in fact, which has led a lot of people to think, like I just mentioned, that Alexander is a kind of philosopher in arms, that he was really deeply shaped by this education under Aristotle. The picture we get of Alexander in the life, I think, doesn't really bear that interpretation out. We don't see Alexander, for the most part, engaging in philosophical disputes. He doesn't seem particularly concerned with philosophical doctrine. He is interested in philosophers and admires them, but it's more for qualities of soul that they share with other people, like free-spiritedness and independence and this sort of thing. We don't really see him developing any deep philosophical interest, I think, in life. And the philosophers around him don't end well. A lot of them die in prison or killed in various other ways. In fact, Aristotle, at the end of Alexander's life, is considered by some to have been the mastermind behind Alexander's assassination. So it doesn't seem to me that the Alexander of the life is really a philosopher in any meaningful sense. What he does get from his training under Aristotle is not so much a concern for philosophy as a concern for Greek culture, and Greek poetry in particular. He's very taken with Greek poetry, and particularly with Homer. He goes out of his way in his campaigns to visit Achilles' grave, where he has funeral games in Achilles' honor. He sleeps every night with an abridged edition of the Iliad under his pillow. And perhaps as a result of that, he has dreams about Homer. Homer visits him in his dreams. Homer tells him where he should build Alexandria in Egypt, for instance, by appearing to him in a dream and uttering some verse to him. Now that's important because with this orientation towards Greek culture for Alexander comes this, Alexander's most distinguishing political project was his conquest of the Persian Empire. As Plutarch tells it in the Lives as a whole, there's a certain trajectory to Greek history, that the Greek story really begins with the cultural unity of the Greek cities, thanks to the fact that they all read or listen to Homer, that they all share the same religion, the same gods. Remember, Herodotus tells us that Homer and Hesiod gave the Greeks their gods. And this cultural unity for Plutarch became a political unity during the Persian Wars, when the Greek cities united to hold off the Persians who were invading Greece. And the story of Greek history would be complete again if the Greek cities were able to unite politically and go conquer Persia, right, with a kind of war of revenge against them. And luckily for Alexander, this project hasn't been done yet when he comes on the scene. So out of his concern for Greek honor, that I think originally springs from his concern with Greek culture and his sense that he has to prove himself to be a full-fledged Greek, he kind of has waiting for him this project of conquering the Persian Empire. So I think this is how we can see Alexander's expansive political action, his conquest of the world and so on, arising not out of his exposure to philosophy, but out of the kind of cultural indeterminacy in his background. The fact that he really wants to prove himself Greek and win the honor of the Greeks. This is how his imperial career starts. Okay, so that's the case against Alexander fitting in the universalist Thumotic account. Now I want to turn and consider why he doesn't fit in the particularist Thumotic account. And the centerpiece of that argument is what in a way is the most distinctive policy of Alexander's imperial expansion, which is that he fuses the customs of the Macedonians and the Greeks on the one hand with the customs of the Persians on the other hand. Now, that might look like a kind of philosophically derived idea of forging a universal global community, but as Plutarch describes it, it's actually a very clever act of political prudence and a very interesting lesson in leadership, too. Alexander, as Plutarch tells it, seems to understand that the different groups that he rules over confer authority and confer legitimacy differently. So for the Macedonians, to be the leader of the Macedonians, you have to be courageous. You have to fight in the front lines of the battle, right? And Alexander does that, and he does it even more towards the end of his life than the beginning. But he realizes that the Persians don't confer authority that way. For the Persians, the trappings of power, the observance of particular customs and so on, this is much more a sign of legitimate authority than fighting in battle is. Plutarch shows us the Persian king fleeing in a very cowardly way from the two of the big battles he fights with Alexander, Issus and Gaugamela. In one case, he leaves his wife and kids on the battlefield as he's running away. So Alexander seems to realize that he can combine these sources of authority of the two major ethnic groups that make up his empire. He can, in a sense, he can fight wearing Persian clothes in the front lines of the Macedonian army, right? He can do both of them simultaneously. And this will allow his rule over the Persians not just to be imperial domination, but to be a legitimate form of rule. That's also ideally acceptable to the Greeks as well. Now, I think Alexander is able to devise that policy both because of the cultural indeterminacy of his background that we've looked at, the fact that for him, culture was always an acquisition. It was something he had to conquer and acquire on his own. So he's sensitive to the ways in which other people can acquire culture, too. That's part of it. But it's also due, I think, to Alexander's ambition. For Plutarch, ambition in its more extreme forms entails the ability to kind of step outside of yourself and to look at the world from the perspective of the person whose honor you seek. Right? So in the most ambitious character, I think, in Plutarch's Lives, Alcibiades, he has this skill in spade. Plutarch says he's more Spartan than the Spartans in Sparta, more Athenian than the Athenians in Athens, and more Persian than the Persians in Persia. And Alexander has that too. He can kind of step outside of himself in order to see the world from the honor giver, right? To see what he would have to do in order to win the honor of the person whose honor he seeks. So because of that, the ambition and the cultural indeterminacy in his background, I think Alexander is able to devise this policy of fusing customs to one another and ruling over a multi-ethnic empire that way. And it shows us that he's not radically constrained by either his Macedonian upbringing or his Greek upbringing. The other Greeks that Plutarch shows us thinking about conquest of the Persians tend to think of it in terms of imperial domination. It'll just be the Greeks lording it over the Persians. Alexander seems to have something else in mind, a rule that's considered legitimate both by Greeks and by Persians. Okay, so that's why Alexander doesn't fit in the universalist Thumotic account or the particularist Thumotic account, and I hope the reasons for that make it clear why he fits a little bit better in my theory of globalization. But I want to conclude by just thinking briefly about the history of globalization and what it would mean for it to have a founder. I mentioned that each of the leading accounts of globalization has a certain spin on Alexander. But Alexander doesn't actually figure prominently in the accounts of history that are associated with the main accounts of globalization. Just to take one example, on the cosmopolitan account of globalization, globalization really starts once human beings are capable of bracketing their particular allegiances to nations or cities or whatever, and considering themselves just as a human being, right, obligated to other human beings. And that usually is understood to have happened with the coming of the world religions of Islam and Christianity, which is to say, a while after Alexander's death. It's only really in the universalist Thumotic account that we've seen that Alexander has a very important role to play, where he can be portrayed as something like the founder of globalization, since he's the first person to attempt a world state. So I have been trying to suggest that Kojève and the other people in the universalist Thumotic account are right to give this important place to Alexander, but they do it for the wrong reasons. That it's better to think of Alexander as the founder of globalization understood with respect to indeterminate identity, rather than understood in this universalist Thumotic account. So why does it matter, though, why we think about how we think about the history of globalization and whether globalization has a founder? Well, I think you can say that the historical investigations into origins in general give a kind of coherence to any story we want to tell about a historical process. It's more coherent if it has a beginning and an end. And by investigating into the origins, a lot of the times we feel as though we can see the essence of a process. We can kind of chip away at the historical accretions and see what it really was at the beginning, kind of see it in the raw, and get a sense of what it is and can be as a result. Sometimes that can be, this sort of historical investigation can be used for moral purposes, as when we discover historically a founding that we want to live up to. Or conversely, we can discover a founding that's kind of besmirched with crimes and atrocities that somehow calls into question the worthiness of the process we're involved in. But in any event, these historical investigations, sometimes we have a sense at least that they have some bearing on the meaning of the project we're involved in the present. But a lot of the times, I think, the motives that lead us to inquire into origins and into foundations don't arise so much from the historian's concern to get the factual truth, to see it very clearly, to see what really happened, but from a more mythical concern, you could say. That is, these stories about the origins seem to hold some explanatory value in the present, independent of whether or not some historically demonstrable link joins the founding times to our own. And as paradigms of that kind of a founding story, you might think of the role that, say, Athens plays in contemporary democratic theory, or the role that the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides play in contemporary IR theory, international relations theory, particularly realist international relations theory. In both of these contemporary theories, these ancient stories play various roles. In some cases, they're exemplary, as when we admire the Athenians, say, for being more wholeheartedly committed to democratic norms than we are, or when we admire Thucydides for seeing the nasty realities of international relations more clearly and more unflinchingly than we're willing to. Right? So they can be exemplary. They can also, I think, serve in their strangeness and their unfamiliarity to open up new perspectives on what's going on in the present. Maybe if the Athenians did democracy differently, that helps us to think about what we're doing, insofar as we are doing democracy too. These ancient stories can also serve precisely in the opposite sense, in their familiarity, to give a kind of gravity and seriousness to the concerns that we're involved in. Right? So if we see that people have been thinking about democracy for millennia, right, this might make us feel as though we have our hands on an elemental problem, an elemental human problem, some kind of preternatural thing that isn't going to go away anytime soon, and that gives a kind of gravity to what we're doing. But those uses of the ancient past tend not to be so much historical, I think, as they are mythical. Right? We don't have to demonstrate an ironclad link between Athenian democracy and ourselves, or between Thucydides and ourselves, to get some sense that they have something to teach us. And that's the sense in which I think Alexander can be appropriated as the founder of globalization. Not so much as a historical claim, but as a kind of mythical claim. It would be nice if Alexander played the same role in our understanding of globalization as Athens does in our understanding of democracy, or Thucydides does in our understanding of international relations. So I think it's in particular in this ambition of the ambiguously Greek Alexander that we can see a desire that's kind of between the desire for universal recognition and between the kind of blinkered orientation to your own particular identity. And that can be a really useful psychological foundation for how we think about globalization. And if that's true, then it would be Plutarch's Alexander, the unphilosophical king from the boondock fringes of Greece, who could justify our fascination with him by playing for us the role of founder of globalization.
Thanks, Hugh. Questions? Hugh, thanks a lot. I have a question that would help, I think, clarify what you're seeking to do with this paper and precisely what Alexander's role is. As I understand it, I read through your paper, not word for word. And
Thanks.
It seems you're trying to defend an account of Alexander's indeterminate identity and not just this global level, but have a number of overlapping identities.
That's right.
I can see why that doesn't fit the cosmopolitanism of, say, Singer or even Nussbaum or Gutman, who are going to emphasize an identity beyond, especially beyond to hold on to national as well as global. But what about, it seems that you could argue that the indeterminacy you're talking about fits well with something like Appia, out of cosmopolitanism, and talk about these overlapping layers of identity and not giving those up for some global identity. So I guess, how is your indeterminacy different than some of those cosmopolitans? I think Nussbaum, especially Appia. And then the other question on Alexander himself is, are you saying that Alexander helps us settle these types, or that he could be properly used by the different 3 or 4 accounts you're giving? Or does he really help justify your account as the best one?
I wish that were true. But no, look, I think there are a number, just let me answer the second question first and then I get the first question. Yeah, there are a number of things that you can do with Alexander. I think a lot of them are valid. I don't think they're necessarily refuted. I do think my reading of Plutarch's Life of Alexander is the best reading of this particular text, but there's plenty of ammunition in there for the other guys too. And there's certainly other competing accounts of Alexander that don't take quite the same tack on him that Plutarch does. We have this long history of Alexander by Arrian, there's Quintus Curtius, lots of sources. So yeah, so I don't want to insist that Alexander only fits in my account. Absolutely, I think he can do lots of different things. In fact, I should mention just on that point that we actually have another text of Alexander's, as since you've read the paper, which is from the Moralia, called The Fortune and Virtue of Alexander, that actually puts him in a much more Kojèvian light than he, in a more Kojèvian light, which is to say he appears much more philosophical and more concerned with kind of cosmopolitan things, universal type concerns. But I think the life of Alexander is a very different story. So not just my count. On the first count, yeah, I don't know the work of Appia very well, so thanks for that. I mean, I'll check that out. I'm sure there are lots of people who think about globalization who think about it in roughly the same way I do, so I don't want to insist too much on, my having come up with this, brand new theory or anything like that. I just want to insist that I think it's better than the other theories I laid out. With Nussbaum, though, I'm a little bit more reluctant to say that my Alexander fits with her story, because it seems to me that she wants to insist much more on the morality of cosmopolitanism, which is to say the fact that the kind of Kantian impulse that we're actually morally bound to respect every individual in the world in a very robust way. And she wants to realize that moral obligation in a way that does some justice to cultural difference. This is, for instance, one of the reasons she's unhappy with the idea of a world state, because she thinks a world state would, bound to not respect cultural difference, and that would be very bad. But I think her fundamental commitments are to this moral picture of cosmopolitanism and not to the difficulty, the moral difficulties that arise when you attend to the overlapping identities. Right? So for me, I want to be able to articulate the moral claim of the nation, or the sense in which that feels like a moral claim at least, and not just say this is an exercise in immorality insofar as we care about the nation or particular identity. So I think that's where I differ with her. Yeah.
I didn't quite hear everything that you said, Dougie boy. So I might be asking a similar thing. That's why I'm prefacing this. Al and I were editors of a collection of. We had a conference with the various papers on leadership and discovery, And one of the people we invited in, a couple of historians. I'm going back to your myth versus history comment. And he warned us against the fact that by starting out by looking at Jamestown, John Smith and Jamestown, in terms of leadership and discovery, we were skewing everything because we were looking at it from a modern perspective, our perspective, and that Smith didn't even think he was discovering anything. Their cosmology had to do that connected Ireland and Virginia and various places around the world as civility and incivility or uncivility and that sort of thing. And they didn't even see it. And he said that what we need to do is understand Smith and his own worldview cosmology instead of imputing our own way of interpreting. He says it's okay, you can find leadership implications from it, but only after you've nailed down what his world was. And what I see here, sort of your myth versus historical thing, is we're reading back into the globalization into Alexander, and we should maybe start the other way to see what his worldview and cosmology was, and then to see if it makes any sense, or might create an entirely new. So it seems to me you're starting at one edge, and I would start at the other.
No, thanks. It's a perfectly valid criticism, particularly as the paper's laid out. I kind of build this theoretical apparatus and then say, like, let's gram it onto Plutarch. And that's not actually how I came to it. I started writing just on the life of Alexander in developing this paper and saw what I thought it said and then tried to see what the implications were present. But I find it very hard, actually, to, it's noble ambition to try to get outside of current prejudices and current perspectives and all this. But I think, especially when dealing with the ancient past, and particularly with Plutarch, also in dealing with Sparta, by the way, but there are certain topics in the ancient past that are, it's practically, 99.9% impossible to get out of someone's, contemporary viewpoint. Plutarch is writing this, probably sometime towards the end of the 1st century, maybe the beginning of the 2nd century, our era. So he's separated by half a millennium from Alexander. He's dealing with sources that he thinks are Alexander's letters, but we think probably weren't, and all these other sources. So it's very muddy, like exactly who is your eyewitness account. So one response to that, which I think is not quite as cowardly as it seems, is to throw up your hands and say, look, we just can't know the history of this stuff. What can it do for us in the present? Treat it more as myth and see what it can do for you. And I'm okay with that. Now, I think, though, I do try to be very sensitive to the contemporary concerns of Plutarch as opposed to Alexander. That's why I wanted to lay out the sense in which it's not false to foist on to Plutarch this idea about multiple identities. I think he's very much concerned with that because of his historical situation. But as for the perspective of Alexander himself, I just don't think we can do too much in that, and that's not what I'm not going to try to do that. I don't think, but yeah.
I guess I'm confused. It almost sounds like Plutarch is the founder of globalization, as you're talking about it, more than Alexander. Alexander seems completely up for grabs in terms of what he was like. I think you're using Plutarch as a fairly authoritative source on Alexander, but you say it's half a millennium, and other people have different interpretations. So I don't quite know where he fits, who's the founder. It almost sounds like Liebert's the founder of globalization.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't sound like that. That would be very bad.
Because he's telling you what globalization is.
Well, yeah, it might be Plutarch. All that I want to say is that Plutarch's Alexander is the founder of globalization. In that sense, I really don't have much at stake in claiming that the historical Alexander is. On the other hand, I don't find a lot of very good reasons to doubt the factuality of a lot of what Plutarch says in Alexander. He's actually pretty careful, as ancient historians go, about telling us who his sources are, what their biases might be, giving us multiple versions of a story to let us work out which we think is right. Like, for instance, the story about Aristotle being involved in the assassination of Alexander is presented as like, this is something some people say. You might want to think about it, but there are lots of other stories about this too, right? So, Plutarch's, fairly responsible by modern criteria, but look, I think that's a valid criticism. I'm not sure I see that it's a big problem with my argument that it's Plutarch's Alexander and not Alexander himself that I want to claim as the founder of globalization. But, yeah, that's right, yeah.
Well, maybe it doesn't make any difference,
Okay.
but I'm leaving with the idea that maybe Plutarch is more the founder than Alexander.
Well, okay, let me put it...
Or Plutarch's Alexander.
Let me try one more way, because Plutarch says at the beginning of the life of Alexander, he gives us this very famous statement about what he's doing in the parallel lives. And he says, what I'm doing here is I'm not trying to write histories, right? So I'm not going to give you a line-by-line account of every battle that Alexander fought or anything like that. And it might disappoint some of his readers that he doesn't do it. Instead, he's writing lives. And lives are not about getting the historical facts right, although they're not opposed to that necessarily. But lives are about searching the souls of men. There are psychological studies. And if that's the main concern and not historical accuracy, then you can see how Plutarch kind of announces himself that he's not primarily concerned with historical matters about getting Alexander totally right. Now, obviously, I don't think he's making stuff up or anything like that, but I think he's willing to bend how he tells the story and sometimes bend the story itself in order to illuminate what he thinks is interesting about a particular figure he's writing about. And one of the things he's interested in, I think, very clearly from life, is this problem of cultural interchange that leads to the indeterminate identity and all that.
How do you look at the fact that this Alexander's great empire broke into pieces
Yeah.
after his death?
Yeah, thanks.
And like, what was the things that he failed to do in his literature of globalization?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. It's a huge thing that I don't deal with at all in my paper, so it's a very, very good question to ask. I don't deal with it mainly because I don't really have space. I think the way Plutarch treats it is more or less consistent with what I want to do. But yeah, so the story that Plutarch tells about this is that Alexander starts off conquering the Persian Empire, and I think, like I argued, it makes a kind of sense within the Greek mind, the sort of how they understand their own history and what they want to do in the future. Everything falls apart after that stage in Alexander's career. He pushes on past Persia and goes and conquers India, what they call really Afghanistan mostly. He goes and conquers Afghanistan, and he gets progressively more despotic. Things really go horrible until you can claim at the end of his life that he might have been assassinated with some degree of plausibility. So one thing I guess that teaches us about leadership is that don't go conquer Afghanistan. Maybe is one thing. Another thing is know your limits. I mean, he kind of goes outside of a political project that makes sense to the people he's leading. And that's when things really start to fall apart. Not only in the sense of the loyalty of his people, although that's part of it, but also in terms of his own psychology. It doesn't seem like he can make sense to himself, really, of what he's doing anymore once he goes past Persia. Now, I should say that another thing that we learn from this, which is actually kind of strengthens the particularist Thumotic account, or that approach to globalization, is that his empire falls apart immediately after his death. Right? When people talk about the failure of Alexander, that's usually what they have in mind, that there's no kind of lasting structure. In fact, in the Pentagon study I mentioned, this is the failure that they mentioned. There's no lasting structure. It's just charismatic leadership. When he fades, everything else fades with him. The political bodies he conquers end up looking a lot more like the kind of national and administrative groups that existed before he conquered them than they look like a universal state. Which is to say that maybe we learn from this example of Alexander to take very seriously the importance of these national groupings and ethnic allegiances and so on. Yeah, but it's a good question. Thank you.
Say more about Plutarch's method itself and the implications for thinking about these issues. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about the fact of someone looking at it in his time and what they might give, and our looking at it in our time, in the assumptions that we can see, from the contrast between two kinds of things that are very different from each other and from us, given the temporal difference. I mean, what kind of assumptions are there about maybe identity, globalization, that are kind of in the method itself?
Yeah. Well, I think there are assumptions. This is a problem when you're interpreting any ancient text, or really any text for that matter, but particularly ancient texts, like I was saying earlier. I guess maybe, can you say a little bit more about what you mean by the assumptions that were?
Well, I guess the idea of setting this up as, and what's striking to me is the fact of the contrast between two different. I mean, it assumes that by you can see, in some ways, it seems to support a more cosmopolitan understanding of what we are.
Yeah.
The fact that you can look at two things that are very different from each other. and learn from that. And then now the fact that you can look at it across time
Right.
and do the same sorts of things. I mean, are there implications from the very setup, the methodology,
Yeah, sure.
that would point us in one direction as opposed to another?
Yeah, it's definitely the case that Plutarch does not think that because someone lived millennia ago, we can't understand what they're doing or we can't learn from them, right? He clearly thinks that I mean, he writes lives of people like Theseus and Romulus, these mythical figures, almost as if they were real historical figures, because he thinks there's a particular psychological phenomenon of founding that he wants to explore. So that's part of it. Now, if there's an implicit cosmopolitanism in the parallel form, I think that's a really good question. Most people, like I said, well, I don't know if most people, a very substantial number of people read the lives like that's true. Like what he's showing is that since we can compare these people, there's a kind of universal human nature, and there's really not such a difference between Greece and Rome. I think that's true in a certain sense. I mean, it has to be. They are comparable. He's not just saying these are radically different people. At the same time, I think the kind of eternal element of human nature that Plutarch is really interested in my reading of him, is this thumotic part of the soul, the spirited, competitive, ambitious part of the soul. And it's a kind of a funny thing that if that's what you consider to be really important and universal in human nature, you in a way can't present human nature as a uniform thing, because it's the part of human nature that always wants to fight and claim that it's not like anything else, or wants a distinction from being on its own that you're trying to depict. So I guess what I'd say is that by putting these people into competition and aligning them along cultural lines, he's actually kind of demonstrating what he considers to be universal. But it's something like the universal willingness to fight, that I think is really important to him. And that's not exactly cosmopolitanism. Yeah.
I don't know if that really makes some sense, but if you distinguish between motives and goals, thinking about President, he kept on going and Aristotle. If he was motivated by identification or by desire for identity,
Mm-hmm.
would it make sense to think that maybe his goals confused his motives or not confused, sort of denied his strive for identity? Somehow, if he was looking for identity, then why does he keep going on and somehow it's some kind of goal, a fire or some kind of goal interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually. Can I just restate it, and you tell me if I'm getting anywhere near what you were asking? But you could look at the life of Alexander and say, if he stops at Persia and says, I'm very happy that I've conquered Persia, the Greeks are going to love me now, and says, I'm going to rule over this stable empire, and that's all I ever wanted in life, then my reading of Alexander looks very plausible, right? The fact that he goes on past the Persian Empire makes it seem as though maybe what he wasn't interested in, even from the start, was Greek honor. Is that basically? Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Now, in Plutarch's life, he presents, I think, a kind of evolution in Alexander's character. And this is, my kind of way of dealing with this, that he seems to think there is a certain nobility and a kind of coherence to his conquest of the Persian Empire, and that Alexander is kind of aware of that too. And he does stop for a long time after conquering the Persian Empire, and that's mirrored in the literary way that Plutarch presents it. There's a long hiatus in the life after he's conquered Persia and before he sets out for India. And then there's a degeneration, I think, in his motives, where he just starts to want to conquer everyone. Or he wants to see the ocean. There's a very weird line, too, where he's like, if I could just get to the end of this and really conquer everything and see what we've heard about over there, at the other, on the eastern side of India, then I'd be done. I don't think those are most at the beginning, although maybe, you could say, which I think actually wouldn't be such a bad reading of it, that those motives are actually the motives that Alexander shows before he's educated under Aristotle, right? So you could say something like, if you look at Aristotle's childhood, Alexander's childhood, as I've described it, you see this kind of all-purpose ambition, right? Just wants to do everything great that he possibly can do. Maybe that's really the essence of Alexander's character, and that there's just a window running from, whenever like 12 or 13 or whatever, when he falls under Aristotle's tutorship, to when he conquers the Persian Empire, where he's worried about his Greek identity. That might be, which would definitely argue against the reading I just gave. But I would want to then insist, somewhat weakly and timidly, on the fact that Alexander, between those goalposts, is the founder of indeterminate identity, and that's a different thing. But I think it's still open to me, as I said, in response to this question, to say that there's a kind of degeneration in Alexander's character, and that we can actually learn from this about the way